The purpose of this channel is going to be to describe how libertarian culture would work without traditional coercive governments. Libertarians are often asked questions like how will banks and schools and police and roads work without government? And these are legitimate questions that need to be taken seriously and need answers. So I'm going to do my best to answer them on this channel, as well as interview guests. But as an intro, I'd like to define libertarianism. For starters, I want to discard the version of libertarianism that you heard during the last presidential election. Libertarianism is not fiscally conservative and socially liberal. That would imply we want liberals to change their values and be 50% conservative, and conservatives to change their values and become 50% liberal. Libertarians, in actuality, though, don't want to change the values of Democrats or Republicans. Instead, we want Democrats and Republicans to extend their daily values of persuasion and voluntary trade to their political decisions. And secondly, I'd like to point out that libertarianism is not a political philosophy. It's a social philosophy that has political ramifications. As a social philosophy, libertarianism seeks to identify consistent human relational principles, which everyone should use to maximize peace and prosperity for themselves and everyone else in their culture. And I think there are two consistent human relational principles which apply to everyone. The first being that most people, most of the time, strive to be happy and to find their version of happiness in life. And secondly, that anytime someone uses violence and force to hurt another person or steal their property, that happiness goes down. These principles, in my opinion, are universal to everyone and consistent. That people strive to be happy, and when someone physically or coercively harms another, human happiness and prosperity diminishes. So libertarian principles teach us that in order to maximize peace, prosperity, and harmony for all, individuals should avoid using all forms of violence, theft, and coercion. Now, governments, by their very existence, violate these peaceful libertarian principles, as politicians and bureaucrats use coercion and gun violence to impose their values on the rest of society. Almost every action taken by government is backed by coercion and gun violence. For example, if you refuse to pay your income taxes, well then men with guns will come kidnap you and throw you in a cage. Now, should you resist their kidnapping because, after all, you've harmed no one and they are using coercion against you, they will reinforce their kidnapping and theft with gun violence and may even kill you if you resist enough. The individual and universal application of governmental ethics would destroy your life and our civilization. If you or I used governmental principles in our personal lives, we would quickly find ourselves without a job, friends, or family, because no one wants to do business with or associate with a person that resorts to coercion and gun violence when dealing with others. Politicians and governments, by their very nature, destabilize cultural peace and evolution because governments monopolize markets and divide individuals in a never-ending struggle to exercise ownership of the state's coercive abilities. The truth is, we will never reach our cultural potential so long as we have politicians and governments using coercion and gun violence to impose their views on the rest of society. Most cultures have evolved past kings and queens and feudalism and mercantilism and communism and fascism. However, there is one human trait which all cultures have yet to overcome and which is holding progress back, and that's our obedience to men and women in politically manufactured authoritative positions. It's 2018, people. We need to move past the idea that we need self-serving politicians and their gun violence to organize and regulate our human interactions. Political elections and representative governments are 17th century technologies. In the age of airplanes and self-driving cars, we're being governed by men and women holding guns to our heads to enforce ideas and ideologies which are 300 years old. Our culture is ready to evolve past regressive politicians and their archaic way of organizing human interaction and into a culture which is organized by volunteerism, where all social and economic interactions are guided by free people choosing to freely interact with one another. Now, freedom will not only lead to more peace and prosperity, but a culture which embraces libertarian values will be safer. In general, your ability and willingness to defend yourself may not be enough to stop someone else's offensive actions, and the police and laws in most cases do not prevent aggressive acts. For the most part, what prevents another person from being violent against you stems from the values which the other person holds. The best defense you have against another violent human being is that their ethics and culture has taught them to not be violent in the first place, which is a libertarian culture. Libertarian ethics and values promote peace and voluntary cooperation. Governmental values are centered on coercion and destabilize voluntary interactions. It's time we end our obedience to politicians. Society's obedience to politicians and their sick political desire for war has resulted in 200 million deaths in the last 150 years. Isn't that proof enough that governmental ethics are ruining our ability to live in peace? How many wars and corresponding deaths have the cultures and values of Target and Walmart and Amazon or Ford or Apple started in the last 100 years? I'd wager it's zero. Free markets and free people govern themselves in voluntary manners. They must if they are to trade and be successful. The best long-term sustainable way to maximize human happiness, peace, and prosperity is to raise the cultural ethics of society to where everyone recognizes the individual and common benefits of using persuasion instead of coercion and trade instead of theft. Understanding that people seek to be happy and that coercion decreases happiness, we would all be better off if we move towards eliminating government and embrace libertarian cultural values. So, what exactly is libertarianism? Libertarianism is a social philosophy. And as a social philosophy, libertarianism seeks to promote a culture where individuals hold voluntary interactions as the primary ethic which guides their relationships with others. And libertarians as a people want to progress our culture to that ethical standard. And that's the thing with King.